The cold does not care how badly you want to live. At 71 degrees below zero, the Siberian wilderness became something beyond winter. The air itself felt dangerous, heavy and sharp, as if every breath carried tiny pieces of glass into the lungs. Snow drifted endlessly across the frozen landscape, erasing roads, fences, even entire trees beneath layers of white silence. Somewhere inside that endless storm stood a small wooden cabin barely holding itself together against the wind. Its windows rattled, its roof groaned, and inside, Evelyn Carter sat wrapped in 3 blankets beside a dying fire, trying not to notice how quickly the warmth was disappearing. Ghost lay near her feet, silent as always, his pale fur glowing orange beneath the weak firelight. The Husky had not moved in almost an hour. That was what frightened her most. Usually he paced when storms came. Usually he watched the windows, ears twitching at every sound outside. But tonight he only stared at the front door as if he sensed something waiting beyond it. Evelyn rubbed her freezing hands together and glanced at the old thermometer hanging beside the kitchen shelf. -71 degrees. The lowest temperature she had seen all winter. Maybe the lowest she had ever seen in her life. The power had failed 2 hours earlier. The backup generator never started. And now the fire was losing its fight against the cold creeping through the cabin walls. She tried to laugh quietly to herself. We've survived worse than this before, haven't we? Ghost lifted his head slightly when he heard her voice. His icy blue eyes met hers for only a moment before drifting back toward the door. Outside, the wind howled across the forest like something searching. Evelyn hated that sound. Out here, storms did not feel natural. They felt alive. She stood carefully and walked toward the wood stove, adding the last 2 logs she had left. Flames flickered weakly before swallowing the wood with a soft crackle. Not enough. She already knew it would not last until morning. The nearest town sat almost 40 miles away, and the roads had disappeared beneath the blizzard hours ago. No rescue trucks. No snowplows. No neighbors checking in. Just snow. Endless snow. Ghost suddenly stood up. The movement startled her. His ears sharpened forward, body stiffening toward the cabin entrance. Then came the sound. A deep cracking noise somewhere above them. Evelyn froze. Another crack followed, louder this time. Snow dust drifted from the ceiling beams. The storm outside had grown stronger. Much stronger. Ghost moved closer immediately, pressing himself against her leg. His body felt warmer than the room itself now. Evelyn swallowed hard and whispered, "It's okay." But even she no longer believed it. The windows had started frosting from the inside. That only happened when the temperature inside dropped dangerously low. She could already feel numbness crawling into her fingertips. Her breaths came slower, heavier. Exhaustion settled over her shoulders like invisible weight. The storm wanted people to sleep. That was how the cold killed you. Quietly, patiently. First came the numbness, then the strange comfort, then the feeling that lying down for just a minute sounded better than fighting anymore. Ghost knew it before she did. He walked directly in front of her and blocked her path when she tried moving toward the couch. His low whine barely rose above the wind, but his eyes stayed locked onto hers with unsettling intensity. "Ghost," she whispered weakly. The Husky stepped closer and pushed his nose into her hand. Warm breath touched her frozen skin. Outside, another violent gust slammed against the cabin walls hard enough to shake the entire structure. The lights hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, a tree cracked and collapsed into the snow. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. Ghost suddenly turned toward the door again and growled softly under his breath. Not angry, afraid. That was the moment Evelyn realized something she would remember for the rest of her life. The storm was getting closer, and Ghost already knew they were running out of time. The storm did not arrive all at once. It tightened around the cabin slowly, like invisible hands closing one finger at a time. Evelyn could hear it in the walls first. The old wood creaked beneath the pressure of the wind while frost spread across the windows in pale white veins. The fire inside the stove had already weakened into a bed of glowing embers, and every minute the darkness inside the cabin seemed colder than the one before. Ghost would not sit down anymore. He paced between the front door and the back window with restless precision, claws tapping softly against the wooden floorboards. Every few seconds he stopped and listened, not to the wind, to something deeper hidden inside it. Evelyn pulled the blankets tighter around herself and tried to ignore the growing heaviness in her body. Her eyelids felt strangely warm now, almost comforting, but she knew enough about winter storms to understand what that feeling meant. Hypothermia did not always arrive with pain. Sometimes it arrived gently, like sleep. She forced herself to stand and walk toward the kitchen sink, turning the faucet out of habit even though nothing came out except a hollow metallic cough from the frozen pipes. "Come on," she whispered to herself. "Just make it through the night." Ghost immediately stopped pacing and looked at her again. The Husky's eyes seemed different now, focused, urgent, as though he understood something she still refused to accept. Then the cabin lights flickered once. A weak pulse. Another flicker followed before everything disappeared into darkness. Evelyn froze completely. The storm outside suddenly sounded louder without the hum of electricity. Wind slammed against the walls hard enough to shake loose dust from the ceiling beams. The silence between each gust felt even worse. Ghost moved beside her instantly, pressing against her leg with nervous energy. Evelyn reached for the flashlight near the counter and clicked it on. The weak beam barely touched the edges of the room before fading into shadow. The cabin no longer felt safe. It felt stranded, forgotten. Another cracking sound exploded overhead, this one so violent that Evelyn instinctively ducked. Snow drifted down from the ceiling again. Somewhere above them, part of the roof was beginning to split under the weight of ice. Ghost let out a sharp bark for the first time all night. Not aggressive. Warning. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled. She grabbed her winter coat from the chair and pulled it on with trembling hands. But even the thick layers did almost nothing against the cold spreading through the room. Her fingers were already losing feeling. The flashlight shook in her grasp. "We are okay," she whispered again, though the words sounded weaker now. Ghost stared directly at her. Then, unexpectedly, he ran toward the front door and scratched at it hard enough to rattle the wood. Evelyn blinked in confusion. "No," she said immediately. "We cannot go out there." The Husky barked again, louder this time. The storm answered with another violent impact against the cabin walls. Then came the sound she would never forget. A long groaning crack from somewhere deep inside the structure itself. The cabin shifted slightly beneath her feet. Evelyn's stomach tightened with fear. The roof was failing. Ghost rushed back toward her and grabbed the sleeve of her coat gently between his teeth. Pulling, urging. His entire body trembled with urgency now. Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. The storm outside could kill them within minutes, but staying inside suddenly felt even worse. Another beam above them snapped with a deafening crack. Snow burst through the ceiling near the fireplace in a violent rush of icy wind. The fire disappeared instantly beneath white powder. Darkness swallowed the room completely except for the weak flashlight beam dancing across collapsing walls. Ghost barked again and pulled harder at her sleeve. Evelyn could barely think clearly anymore. Cold had already started slowing her thoughts, wrapping her mind in heavy fog. But somewhere beneath the fear, she realized something terrifying. Ghost had sensed this long before she did. He had known the cabin was dying. The Husky pulled toward the door once more, and this time Evelyn followed him into the screaming white darkness outside, unaware that the storm waiting beyond the cabin was only the beginning. The cold outside did not feel like weather anymore. It felt endless. The moment Evelyn stepped beyond the cabin door, the storm swallowed her completely. Wind struck her face with such force that breathing instantly became difficult, every inhale sharp enough to burn her lungs. Snow spun violently across the darkness, erasing the world only a few feet ahead. The cabin behind them was already fading into white shadow, as if the storm wanted to erase all proof it had ever existed. Ghost pushed forward through the snowdrifts without hesitation, his thick fur coated in ice within seconds. Evelyn stumbled after him blindly, one shaking hand gripping the back of his harness while the other shielded her face from the freezing wind. Her boots sank deep into the snow with every step. The cold reached through every layer she wore now, crawling slowly into her muscles, making movement heavier with each passing minute. Somewhere behind them came the deep collapsing groan of the cabin finally giving way. Evelyn stopped instinctively and turned toward the sound. For a brief moment, through the swirling snow, she saw part of the roof disappear beneath the storm. Then even that vanished. Their home was gone. Ghost barked sharply and pulled forward again before she could fully process it. He did not let her stand still for more than a second, almost as if he understood that stopping meant dying. The forest around them had become a maze of black tree shapes barely visible through the white chaos. Branches creaked overhead beneath layers of ice. Wind screamed endlessly between the pines like distant voices calling through the dark. Evelyn had tried focusing on Ghost's movements because looking anywhere else only made the storm feel larger. The husky moved with strange certainty, weaving through the forest as though some invisible instinct guided him through the blizzard. But Evelyn's body was beginning to fail. Her legs felt numb from the knees down. Her fingers no longer responded properly inside her gloves. Even her thoughts came slower now, drifting in and out beneath the hypnotic sound of the wind. She stumbled hard against a buried rock beneath the snow and collapsed to one knee. Pain barely registered through the cold. Ghost immediately turned back toward her, circling anxiously while snow collected across his fur. "I cannot," Evelyn whispered weakly, though the words vanished into the storm almost instantly. The husky stepped closer and pressed his face against hers. Warm breath touched her frozen skin for only a second before the wind stole it away. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed on her with desperate intensity. Then, unexpectedly, Ghost moved behind her and pushed against her back with his body, urging her upright again. Evelyn nearly cried from exhaustion. She did not know how long they had been walking anymore. 10 minutes. An hour. Time disappeared in storms like this. The world became nothing except cold and movement. Then Ghost suddenly stopped. His ears lifted sharply forward. Evelyn could barely see through the white darkness, but she noticed it a second later too. A faint shape ahead between the trees. Small. Dark. Still. At first she thought it was another cabin. Hope flickered painfully inside her chest. But as they moved closer, she realized it was only an abandoned snowmobile half buried beneath drifting ice. The machine sat crooked beside a dead pine tree, frozen solid beneath layers of snow. Evelyn's heart sank. Ghost sniffed around it briefly before turning away again. But the brief pause had cost her. The moment they started moving once more, dizziness hit her so suddenly that the forest tilted sideways. Her breathing slowed. A strange warmth spread through her chest despite the freezing air. Dangerous warmth. The kind that arrived just before the body gave up fighting. She fell again, this time fully into the snow. The cold beneath her strangely no longer felt painful. It felt soft, quiet, peaceful. Above her, snowflakes drifted endlessly through the darkness while the storm howled far away like some distant dream. Evelyn closed her eyes for only a second. Just 1 second to rest. But Ghost began barking immediately. Loud. Panicked. He pawed at her coat frantically before grabbing her sleeve between his teeth and pulling with all his strength. Evelyn barely reacted. Her body no longer wanted to move. Yet Ghost refused to stop. Again and again he pulled at her through the snow while the storm closed tighter around them both. And somewhere beyond the white darkness ahead, hidden deep within the forest, a single dim light flickered for only a moment before disappearing completely. Ghost would not let her disappear into the snow. Every time Evelyn's eyes drifted closed, the husky barked again, sharp and desperate beneath the roar of the storm. His paws scraped frantically against her coat, while icy wind buried them deeper by the second. Evelyn barely felt it anymore. The cold had moved beyond pain now. Her body felt strangely light, almost distant, as if she were floating somewhere far away from the forest. She could hear the wind, but it sounded muffled, slow, dreamlike. Somewhere inside the white darkness, Ghost grabbed her sleeve with his teeth again and pulled backward with all his strength. The fabric stretched. Snow shifted beneath her body inch by inch. The husky strained harder, paws digging desperately into the drift while frost thickened around his muzzle. Evelyn opened her eyes weakly. Through the blur of snow she saw Ghost stumbling from exhaustion, yet every time he slipped, he forced himself upright again. He refused to stop pulling her. "Ghost," she whispered faintly, barely able to hear her own voice. The husky barked once in response and continued dragging her through the storm. Then Evelyn saw it again. That faint light, far ahead between the trees. This time it lasted longer. A dim yellow glow hidden behind the swirling snow. Hope flickered weakly inside her chest, though it almost hurt to feel it. Ghost saw it too. His ears lifted immediately. Suddenly the husky pulled harder than before, almost frantic now. as though he understood that whatever waited ahead might be their last chance. Evelyn tried to help by pushing herself up onto trembling knees. The effort nearly made her collapse again. Her muscles no longer obeyed properly. Her fingers felt frozen solid inside her gloves. But Ghost stayed beside her, pressing his body against her legs every time she swayed too far sideways. Together, they moved slowly through the storm toward the distant light. The forest around them grew darker as snow buried the lower branches of the pine trees. Wind twisted through the woods in violent bursts that erased all sound except the endless howl of winter. Several times Evelyn lost sight of the light completely, and panic surged through her chest. But each time Ghost kept moving forward without hesitation, as if he could smell warmth hidden somewhere beyond the storm. Finally, the shape appeared through the white darkness. A small hunting shack sat crooked among the trees, half buried beneath snowdrifts nearly reaching the windows. One weak lantern glowed beside the entrance, flickering wildly in the wind. Evelyn almost cried from relief. Ghost barked loudly and hurried toward the structure, but the closer they came, the more abandoned the shack looked. The windows were frozen opaque. Snow covered most of the roof. No footprints surrounded the building. No smoke rose from the chimney. Still, shelter was shelter. Evelyn reached the door with barely enough strength left to stand. She twisted the handle once. Locked. Panic immediately flashed through her exhausted mind. Ghost began scratching furiously at the wood, while Evelyn pounded weakly against the door with numb hands. "Please," she whispered to no one. "Please." Another brutal gust of wind slammed into them from behind hard enough to nearly knock her into the snow again. Ghost suddenly moved sideways toward one of the cabin windows and barked sharply. Evelyn followed his gaze. The corner of the glass had already cracked beneath the cold. Summoning the last strength she had left, she grabbed a frozen branch buried nearby and struck the weakened window once. The glass shattered inward beneath the storm. Freezing air exploded through the opening, but Ghost immediately climbed through first. Moments later, the Husky pushed against the door from inside until the old latch finally gave way with a loud snap. Evelyn stumbled into the cabin after him and collapsed to the wooden floor, gasping for breath. The silence inside felt unreal after the screaming storm outside. It was still freezing cold, but at least the wind no longer tore through her skin. Ghost circled her anxiously while snow melted slowly from his fur onto the floorboards. The shack smelled old. Empty. Forgotten. A dusty cot stood against one wall beside a rusted stove that had clearly not been used in years. But in the corner sat a stack of dry firewood untouched beneath a tarp. Evelyn stared at it in disbelief. For the first time all night, survival felt possible. Ghost moved beside her again, pressing against her shoulder while she struggled toward the stove with shaking hands. But outside, beyond the thin cabin walls, the storm had not weakened at all. In fact, somewhere deep in the forest beyond the shack, another sound had started rising beneath the wind. Low, distant, like ice beginning to crack across a frozen lake. For the first time since the storm began, Evelyn could hear something other than the wind. The slow crackling sound of fire returning to life inside the rusted stove felt almost unreal, like a memory from another world. Her shaking hands hovered near the weak flames while warmth slowly touched her frozen skin again. It hurt at first. Sharp needles of pain crawled through her fingertips as feeling returned inch by inch. Ghost lay beside the stove, breathing heavily, his thick white fur still dusted with melting snow. The Husky looked exhausted now. His sides rose and fell faster than before, and every few moments he lifted his head toward the walls of the cabin as if still listening for danger outside. Evelyn pulled an old blanket from the corner and wrapped it around both of them. "You saved me," she whispered quietly, her voice raw from cold air and fear. Ghost lowered his head into her lap for only a second before his ears twitched sharply again. That sound outside had grown louder. The strange cracking noise carried beneath the storm in uneven bursts, distant but growing closer with every passing minute. Evelyn tried to ignore it. The warmth inside the shack had already started clouding her thoughts with exhaustion. Her entire body begged her to close her eyes and sleep. But something about Ghost's behavior kept her awake. He would not relax. Even now, after reaching shelter, he watched the door constantly, as though he knew the storm had not finished with them yet. Evelyn forced herself upright, and searched the tiny cabin carefully with the flashlight she had managed to keep clipped to her coat. The beam swept across dusty shelves. Broken tools, frozen cans left untouched for years. Whoever owned this place had abandoned it long ago. Yet somehow the firewood remained dry beneath the tarp, almost like the cabin had been waiting for someone desperate enough to find it. Another crack echoed outside. Louder now. Evelyn froze. Ghost immediately stood and growled low beneath his breath. The floor beneath them vibrated faintly for a moment before becoming still again. Then came silence. Heavy silence. The kind that only existed when nature itself was holding its breath. Evelyn slowly stepped toward the nearest frost-covered window and wiped part of the glass clear with her sleeve. At first she saw nothing except darkness and blowing snow. Then the flashlight beam caught movement far beyond the trees. A long fracture stretched across the frozen surface of a nearby lake hidden behind the forest. Ice was splitting apart beneath the pressure of the storm. The sound she had been hearing was the lake breaking open little by little beneath the cold. Evelyn stepped back instinctively. The hunting shack sat much closer to the shoreline than she realized. If the ice shifted badly enough, the entire ground beneath the cabin could become unstable. Ghost barked sharply beside her. Then the lights flickered. Evelyn stared upward in confusion before realizing the cabin should not have had electricity at all. Yet for a brief second, an old ceiling bulb glowed faint yellow overhead before dying again. Somewhere nearby, power lines still existed, which meant roads could not be too far away. Civilization was somewhere beyond this storm. Hope returned painfully fast. Evelyn grabbed the flashlight tighter and moved toward the back wall where old shelves covered part of the cabin interior. Beneath layers of dust, she discovered something unexpected. A faded emergency radio mounted beside the window. Her heart pounded instantly. She rushed toward it and turned the switch with trembling fingers. Static exploded through the small speaker, loud enough to make Ghost jump. Evelyn adjusted the dial desperately. More static. Then silence. Then finally a weak, broken voice buried beneath interference. Weather emergency. Warning, severe whiteout conditions. All rescue operations suspended until morning. The signal disappeared again. Morning. Evelyn glanced toward the dark windows. She had no idea how many hours remained until sunrise. The storm outside still looked endless. But now she knew one thing for certain. People were out there somewhere. If they survived the night, rescue might still be possible. Ghost suddenly moved away from the stove again and walked toward the front door. His body stiffened instantly. Another low growl escaped his throat. Evelyn turned toward him slowly. At first she heard nothing except the storm. Then came a new sound beneath the wind. Soft, rhythmic, almost buried by the blizzard itself. Footsteps, crunching slowly through the snow outside the cabin. The footsteps outside moved slowly through the snow, uneven and heavy, as if something large wandered blindly through the storm. Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment. Ghost stood perfectly still near the door, his thick fur rising slightly along his back, while a low growl vibrated deep in his chest. The sound outside came closer. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Then silence again. Evelyn tightened her grip on the flashlight. Her exhausted mind raced through impossible explanations. No rescue team would be out in weather like this. No travelers would survive this deep in the wilderness at night. Yet something was definitely there. The lantern hanging beside the cabin window flickered violently as another gust slammed into the shack. Shadows moved across the walls. Ghost stepped in front of Evelyn instinctively, positioning himself between her and the entrance. His pale eyes never left the door. Then came a soft scraping sound against the wood outside. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. For several seconds neither of them moved. The storm roared endlessly around the cabin, while the scratching continued faintly beneath the wind. Finally, Evelyn forced herself closer to the nearest window and wiped away part of the frost with trembling fingers. At first she saw only swirling snow. Then a shape appeared near the porch steps. Small, thin, a deer. The animal stood barely visible through the blizzard, its body covered in frost while dark eyes reflected the weak lantern light. It looked exhausted, lost. For one strange moment, the deer simply stared toward the cabin, as if searching for warmth it could never reach. Then another violent crack echoed from the frozen lake nearby. The deer immediately vanished back into the storm without a sound. Evelyn let out the breath she had been holding. Ghost slowly relaxed, though he still watched the door carefully. It was only scared, Evelyn whispered softly. But the husky did not seem convinced. The storm outside continued growing worse by the minute. Wind now struck the cabin walls hard enough to shake loose flakes of ice from the ceiling beams. Evelyn fed another piece of wood into the stove and moved closer beside Ghost, wrapping the blanket tighter around them both. The fire gave off only limited warmth, but compared to the world outside it felt miraculous. Exhaustion pulled at her harder now. Her body had spent too long fighting the cold already. Even with heat returning, her muscles trembled uncontrollably beneath the blanket. Ghost lay pressed tightly against her side, sharing warmth without moving away for even a second. His breathing had slowed, but every few moments his ears twitched toward the sounds outside, as if he still sensed danger moving through the storm beyond the cabin walls. Evelyn stared into the flames quietly. "Do you remember summer?" she asked weakly. Ghost lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. "The lake behind the cabin. You used to run into the water before I could stop you." A faint smile touched her lips for the first time all night. "You always came back covered in mud." Ghost rested his head against her knee again. Outside, the wind screamed louder. Evelyn's smile slowly faded. The storm no longer sounded natural. It sounded angry now, almost personal. Another loud crack thundered across the frozen lake nearby, followed by a deep shifting vibration beneath the ground itself. The cabin floor trembled for several seconds before becoming still again. Evelyn looked toward the window nervously. The ice was breaking faster now. If the shoreline gave way beneath the storm, the shack could collapse. With it, Ghost suddenly stood again. His entire body stiffened toward the back wall this time instead of the door. Evelyn frowned. Then she heard it too. Water. Faint at first, moving somewhere beneath the cabin floorboards. Her stomach tightened with fear. Meltwater from the fractured lake had started flowing beneath the frozen ground. The storm was tearing the shoreline apart piece by piece. Evelyn forced herself upright despite the dizziness still clouding her thoughts. "We cannot stay here," she whispered. The words terrified her the moment she said them aloud. Going back outside could kill them, but staying suddenly felt just as dangerous. Ghost moved toward the back corner of the cabin where old shelves leaned against the wall. He sniffed around the floorboards briefly before pawing once against the wood. Evelyn aimed the flashlight downward. Hidden beneath layers of dust sat a rusted metal hatch almost invisible beneath the shelves. Her pulse quickened instantly. Slowly she pulled the shelves aside and grabbed the frozen handle with both hands. The hatch resisted at first before finally groaning open beneath her weight. A narrow staircase disappeared downward into complete darkness below the cabin. Then from somewhere deep underneath them, Evelyn heard another sound. A faint mechanical hum echoing softly beneath the storm. The sound beneath the cabin did not belong in a place this abandoned. It was faint, uneven, almost buried beneath the groaning storm outside, but it was there. A low mechanical hum echoing softly through the darkness below the floorboards. Evelyn stared into the open hatch while cold air drifted upward from the hidden staircase. Ghost stood beside her, ears raised sharply forward, every muscle in his body tense with alertness. The husky did not bark this time. Somehow that frightened Evelyn more. She aimed the flashlight downward. The beam disappeared into darkness before finally catching the outline of narrow wooden steps descending beneath the cabin. Dust floated through the cold air like pale smoke. Whatever existed down there had been hidden for years. Another violent tremor shook the cabin. Somewhere outside, ice cracked across the lake with a deep thunderous sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire forest. The floor beneath Evelyn's boots shifted slightly. She no longer needed convincing. Staying upstairs was becoming impossible. "Come on," she whispered weakly to Ghost. Her voice echoed strangely into the darkness below. The husky hesitated only a second before stepping onto the staircase first. Evelyn followed carefully behind him, gripping the rusted railing while the flashlight beam trembled in her freezing hands. The deeper they descended, the quieter the storm became. Soon the screaming wind above faded into distant muffled noise. The underground space smelled old and metallic, mixed with damp wood and something faintly electrical. At the bottom of the staircase, the beam of the flashlight finally revealed the room beneath the cabin. Evelyn stopped in disbelief. It was not a cellar. It looked more like an emergency shelter hidden beneath the hunting shack decades earlier. Shelves lined the walls stocked with dusty supplies covered beneath thick layers of age. Old fuel containers sat beside folded blankets. A rusted lantern hung from the ceiling. In one corner, a small backup generator quietly vibrated with the weak hum they had heard above. Somehow it was still running after all these years. Ghost slowly moved through the room, sniffing carefully while Evelyn stepped farther inside. The shelter felt colder than it should have, but compared to the storm outside, it still felt safer than the collapsing cabin above. Evelyn noticed old photographs scattered across a nearby table. A family once lived here. Smiling faces frozen forever in fading black and white images. Hunters. Children. Winters long forgotten. It felt strange standing inside the remains of another life while a storm tried to erase her own above them. Another tremor shook dust loose from the ceiling. Evelyn flinched instinctively. The ice outside was continuing to break apart. But here underground the sounds felt farther away, less immediate. Ghost suddenly stopped near the back wall. His ears twitched sharply again. Evelyn turned the flashlight toward him. The Husky stood beside a narrow metal door partially hidden. Behind old storage crates. Unlike everything else in the shelter, the door looked newer, cleaner, and beneath it, faint cold air drifted through the gap at the bottom. Evelyn slowly moved closer. Her exhausted reflection stared back at her from the frosted metal surface. Then she noticed the symbol painted near the handle. A faded emergency route marker. Her pulse quickened instantly. A tunnel, she whispered. Ghost pawed once against the floor impatiently. Somewhere above them, a loud crashing sound echoed through the cabin. Snow and dust drifted from the ceiling beams. Evelyn grabbed the handle quickly and pulled. At first the door barely moved. Then with a sharp metallic groan it opened inward, revealing a narrow underground passage disappearing into darkness beyond the flashlight beam. Cold air rushed toward them immediately, carrying the scent of snow and pine from somewhere far ahead. The tunnel led outside the danger zone surrounding the lake. Hope surged painfully inside Evelyn's chest again. Maybe this shelter had been built exactly for storms like this. Maybe survival had always been hidden beneath the cabin waiting to be found. Ghost stepped into the tunnel first without hesitation, but after only a few feet, he suddenly stopped. His body stiffened again. A low growl rolled quietly from his throat while he stared into the darkness ahead. Evelyn lifted the flashlight higher. The beam reached farther down the tunnel this time, finally revealing something lying partially buried beneath fallen debris near the far end. At first she thought it was old equipment. Then the light caught fabric. A winter coat. And beside it, frozen beneath years of dust and silence, lay a human hand. The flashlight trembled violently in Evelyn's hand as the beam rested on the frozen figure buried beneath the debris. For a moment she could not breathe. The narrow tunnel suddenly felt colder than the storm above them. Ghost remained perfectly still beside her, staring into the darkness ahead with silent focus. Evelyn swallowed hard and forced herself one cautious step forward. The fallen boards and broken concrete partially covered the body, but enough remained visible to understand what had happened long ago. Someone had tried to escape through this tunnel during another storm and never made it out. Frost coated the old winter jacket in pale crystals. Time had turned everything still and silent beneath the earth. Evelyn felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. The storm outside no longer felt unique. Others had been trapped here before. Others had also believed they could outrun the cold. Ghost slowly moved closer to the frozen figure and sniffed the air once before stepping back again. He did not growl now. Instead, he looked toward Evelyn with strange intensity, almost as though urging her not to stop moving. Another deep tremor rolled through the tunnel overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling in soft gray clouds. The lake above was continuing to fracture beneath the storm. Evelyn aimed the flashlight farther ahead and saw something that made her pulse quicken instantly. Beyond the collapsed section, the tunnel continued. The debris had not fully sealed the passage. There was still enough space along one side for them to squeeze through. Hope returned painfully fast. If the tunnel truly led away from the lake, they still had a chance. Evelyn stepped carefully around the frozen figure, whispering a quiet apology to someone whose name she would never know. The narrow gap beyond the collapse forced her sideways against the cold concrete wall. Ghost slipped through first with ease before turning back toward her. His pale eyes reflected the flashlight beam like faint silver in the darkness. For several tense seconds, Evelyn struggled through the narrow opening while debris shifted overhead. Then suddenly the ground shook again, much harder this time. A thunderous cracking roar exploded above them, followed by the terrifying sound of rushing water somewhere deep beneath the earth. Evelyn froze instantly. Ghost barked sharply. The fractured lake had finally started breaking apart. Ice and water surged somewhere beneath the frozen ground outside, while the tunnel walls groaned under the pressure. Dust burst from the ceiling. Small rocks scattered across the floor. "Go," Evelyn whispered breathlessly, panic rising through her chest. Ghost immediately turned and ran deeper into the tunnel. Evelyn followed as quickly as her exhausted body allowed, stumbling through darkness while the world around them trembled. The tunnel curved sharply several yards ahead before beginning to slope upward. Cold air rushed stronger now, carrying the scent of pine trees and snow from somewhere beyond the darkness. The exit was close, but behind them the sounds of collapse grew louder. Water thundered through the earth like some giant creature awakening beneath the frozen wilderness. Evelyn's lungs burned from exhaustion. Her legs barely obeyed anymore. Several times she slipped on ice covering the tunnel floor, catching herself against the walls before falling completely. Ghost stayed only a few feet ahead, constantly stopping to make sure she continued following him. He refused to leave her behind, even for a moment. Then the flashlight beam finally caught something impossible. Moonlight. Faint silver light spilled through an opening ahead where the tunnel emerged from the mountainside beyond the forest. Evelyn nearly cried from relief. She pushed herself forward desperately, every remaining ounce of strength focused on reaching the exit. Ghost reached the opening first and disappeared outside into the storm. Evelyn climbed after him and emerged into freezing wind once more. But the world outside had changed. The storm was still raging, yet from the hillside above the forest, she could now see the frozen lake far below. Massive fractures split across the ice like glowing scars beneath the moonlight. Entire sections of the shoreline had already collapsed into dark, freezing water. The hunting shack where they had hidden only minutes earlier tilted dangerously toward the breaking lake beneath it. Evelyn stared in horror. If they had stayed inside much longer, the cabin would have disappeared with the shoreline. Ghost stood beside her silently while snow whipped across the mountainside around them. For a brief moment, despite the storm, survival felt possible again. Then Evelyn noticed something in the distance through the blowing snow. Far beyond the trees, faint red lights moved slowly. Across the darkness, vehicles, rescue crews. Her heart pounded wildly. They were close. So close. Evelyn took one step forward toward the lights before suddenly collapsing hard into the snow. Her vision blurred instantly. The warmth had returned again. That dangerous warmth. Her body had reached its limit. Ghost rushed back toward her immediately, barking desperately into the storm while the rescue lights continued moving somewhere far beyond the frozen wilderness, still unaware of how little time remained. Snow swallowed Evelyn the moment she collapsed. The cold no longer felt sharp anymore. It felt distant now, almost gentle, wrapping around her body like heavy silence. Above her, the storm blurred the sky into endless white darkness while the red rescue lights flickered faintly between the trees far below the mountain ridge. They were close enough to see, too far to hear. Evelyn tried forcing herself upright, but her arms barely responded. Exhaustion had drained everything from her. Every breath felt smaller than the one before. Ghost barked frantically beside her, circling through the snow while icy wind buried his tracks almost instantly. The husky pushed his nose beneath her shoulder, trying to lift her. When she could not move, he barked again, louder this time, the sound nearly disappearing beneath the storm. Evelyn opened her eyes weakly and looked at him through drifting snowflakes. Frost covered his fur completely now. Tiny crystals clung to his eyelashes and muzzle, turning the white husky almost ghost-like beneath the moonlight. Yet his pale blue eyes still burned with desperate focus. "I am tired," Evelyn whispered faintly. The words barely escaped her lips. Ghost pressed against her harder immediately, refusing to let her sink deeper into the snow. Somewhere far below, one of the rescue lights disappeared behind the trees. Panic flashed through Evelyn's slowing mind. If they lost sight of the rescue teams now, there would not be another chance. But her body no longer obeyed her. Hypothermia had moved too far. Warmth spread strangely through her chest and arms despite the freezing air around her. Dangerous warmth. The final stage before the body surrendered completely. Ghost seemed to understand before she did. Suddenly, the husky stopped barking. Instead, he climbed directly onto her body and curled tightly against her chest, shielding her from the wind with his own warmth. Evelyn felt his trembling immediately. He was exhausted too. Every breath from the husky came slower than before, but he pressed closer anyway, wrapping himself around her as though trying to hold her spirit inside her body by force. Snow gathered across both of them while the storm continued screaming through the mountainside. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time no longer felt real. Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness while Ghost remained against her without moving. Each time her eyes opened, she saw the same thing. The husky still there, still protecting her from the cold, still refusing to leave. Then the wind shifted slightly. Through the storm came a distant sound. Faint at first. Mechanical. Engines. Ghost lifted his head immediately. His ears twitched sharply toward the forest below. Evelyn could barely hear it, but somewhere beyond the storm snowmobiles were moving through the wilderness. The rescue crews had finally reached the mountain trail. Hope flickered weakly inside her fading thoughts. Ghost suddenly struggled to his feet again despite his exhaustion. He barked into the darkness with everything he had left. Once, twice, again and again. The sound vanished into the storm. Evelyn watched him through half-closed eyes while snow buried the lower half of her body. The husky turned back toward her briefly, and for the first time all night his expression looked uncertain, frightened, as if even he understood his strength was disappearing. Then Ghost did something Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life. Instead of staying beside her warmth, he ran downhill directly into the blizzard toward the distant rescue lights. Evelyn tried calling after him weakly, but her voice disappeared into the wind. Panic surged through her exhausted body. Ghost vanished between the snow-covered trees within seconds. Alone now, Evelyn felt the full weight of the cold closing around her again. The storm immediately seemed louder. Without him beside her, darker, colder. She tried staying awake, focusing on the distant sounds of engines somewhere below the mountain, but her thoughts drifted further away with every passing minute. Snow collected across her coat. Her breathing slowed. Then through the blizzard came barking again. Faint, desperate, closer now. Lights suddenly appeared through the trees below, bright white beams cutting through the storm. Voices echoed faintly beneath the wind. Rescue crews. Evelyn almost cried from relief, but her body could no longer respond. Her vision blurred heavily while the lights climbed closer toward the ridge. Somewhere within the storm, she heard Ghost barking one final time before the sound disappeared completely. Then the world faded into darkness. The last thing Evelyn saw before losing consciousness was a rescue worker kneeling beside her while fresh snow continued falling silently across the mountain. But beside her body,